Hello and welcome to this BlenderCookie.com tutorial. My name is Kernon Dillon and this is part 4 in the Urban Stairway tutorial. And in this part we're going to be doing a quick review of the techniques used in modeling the scene. Okay, let's talk about snapping basics. On the header bar we'll see a magnet icon. If we enable that, that will turn on the snapping function, and you hold the control key down while transforming your object, and that will allow your snapping. And you want to set your snapping element to vertex or whatever element you want, and in the tutorial I used closest. And so I'm just going to add a cube here. Let's move it over and scale it down. And now while I'm transforming, I'm going to hold down the control key and snap to the corner vertices or a corner vertex on the cap. And you'll see a circle around the vertex of another object, just indicating the snapping point. Okay. And it's important to note that the direction that you're moving the object is important as well. So if I move along the x-axis, because I have it set to closest, it's going to snap to the vertices in the object that we're moving that are closest to that vertex that we're snapping to. And that's why you see the orientation the way it is. Okay, and let's delete the cube. And another thing to note is, just to demonstrate that further, if I move this up and I pull it down, you can see that it's snapping the bottom vertices of the object that I'm using, that I'm actually moving, to the closest vertices that I'm snapping to in the target object. And again, it's important to hold the control key down and note the little circle that you see that's highlighting the thing that you're snapping to. And we can also do this in edit mode. You can select geometry and align it to other aspects of geometry and other objects. And another thing that I did in the tutorial was to create temporary geometry in an object. And in the case of one of the trim pieces on the window, I created a loop in the center of one of the trim pieces and then snapped an object to that point and then deleted the loop that I created. And so I'll create a temporary loop with Control R and set it with the middle mouse button so that it's centered in the object, and then snap the scaled cube object to that loop. Okay. And then I can just delete the loop by pressing the X key and then selecting Edge Loop. Alright, so it's a very powerful tool. It would have been very tedious to model this scene without the snapping tool. And that's it. Okay, now let's talk about creating new objects from selected geometry by separating that geometry. And let's take the basic ground or floor geometry that we have, and we can select these vertices and press Shift D to duplicate it. And then we'll press Escape, and then let's press the P key to separate the selected geometry. If we tab back into object mode and we select the object, we can see that we have a separate object based on that geometry that was selected. And then we can go into edit mode. Actually, I'm in a local view using numpad / and then we can go into edit mode and create a new object from this, and it will have perfect alignment and have the shape that we need to be a good starting point without having to create this from scratch. And so it's a great way to reuse geometry that's already in place to create new objects. And that's how we created the opening for the stairway. Okay. Okay, now let's talk about beveling. And using the bevel tool is mostly important for objects that you don't need to really smooth using a subsurf modifier. You just don't want them to be perfectly sharp on the corners, since in the real world nothing is perfectly sharp. And you can just in the edit mode press the W key to bring up the specials menu and then select bevel, and then as you move your mouse you'll see the beveling take place. And you can also bevel more than once, and that can help you to get a nice curve along that edge. And in the tutorial we use this quite a bit for surfaces that didn't get a subsurf modifier added. And we also used it, for example, on these stairs. And I'll just delete the geometry, the faces that we don't need. And then select the edge, and then press the W key, then bevel, and then bevel again. And that's a nice way to get a turn, or a rounded corner, or rounded edge rather. And again, it's important to note that in the real world, nothing is ever perfectly sharp. And you can go a long way to adding realism to your scene by just adding a tiny bit of bevel to an object. And that helps to give it volume and make it just a tad bit more realistic, especially with the lighting. It gives the lighting something to bounce off of to create a nice defining edge for that object. And you can see some of the beveling that we did on the cap. And there's another example. Okay. And also on these stairs, or the steps, we did 2 bevels on the top edge and then 1 bevel on the bottom edge. And that's it. Okay, let's talk about object data linking. And what that simply means is sharing the mesh data between one object and several others, so that changes made in one object are reflected in the other objects that are sharing that same data. And so let's say we start with the cube and then we duplicate it several times. And at some point we decide, well, we want to edit one of the cubes, not necessarily the first one. And we want those changes translated to the other objects. And we don't want to have to duplicate this one object and then reposition it to where the others are and then delete those original objects. So we can shift select all the other objects and then select the one that's been changed last and press Ctrl L and select mesh data. And that last object in the multi-selection will share its data with all the others. And they all share the same data, so you don't necessarily have to edit the first one if you want to change all of them. You can edit any one object that's in that same group. And we can change this relationship by going to the editing buttons window and the links and materials panel and find the mesh data name. And you'll see a number beside that representing the number of objects that are sharing that mesh data. And we can click that button and make it a single user. And now this one object has its own data. and so it's no longer part of the pool of objects that are sharing that data. And you can see that now this collection has 3 objects in it that are sharing the data. And so let's separate this one as well. And then we can shift select the other one and then make these 2 share the data. And so now we have 2 sets of objects that are sharing data between them. And this is a great way to translate changes in one object to other objects in your scene. Okay, now let's talk about aligning objects using the Copy Attributes tool. And basically what you do is you select multiple objects, and the last object in that selection group, the active object, can be used to align all the other objects in the selection to itself. And so let's just move some parts over, totally misaligned to where they were. Okay. And now let's select one of the objects and then shift select where we want to move it to, the object we want to align it to. And then press Control C and select the location from the Copy Attributes menu. And we can see that now the first object selected is aligned to the second object. Okay, and this can be extremely helpful. And the thing to note is that it's aligning the center points of the 2 objects. So if the center point was not at the center of either one of those objects, then they would not align centered, as you see here. And I move the center point of the post, and you can see that now when I use copy location, it puts the second object aligned to that new center point of the post. And now that makes it very easy to use the snapping tool to snap that object into place. And also note that because of the way the snapping tool works, the direction that you're coming from when you're trying to align something does matter, since we have the settings set to closest. And so now let's move the other cap to its original point. Again, selecting the cap and then selecting the post and then pressing Control C and selecting location. And the center points of the objects are aligned, and then we can move it relative to that new location. And as far as getting the connector aligned to the railings, we're not going to be able to get it perfectly aligned to the intersection of those 2 railings, but we can get it aligned to one and then simply move it into place. And I'm sure if you had to have it exactly centered, you could work that out as well, but as far as what we needed for this tutorial, this was good enough. Okay, and so that's Control C, location. Okay, now let's look at the spin and spin duplication tools. And we're going to switch to layer 3, and let's add a mesh circle. And I'm going to turn down the number of vertices to 12. All right. And this is going to be the same way that I created the elbows for the railings in the scene. And we're switching to a top view and rotating around the x-axis 90 degrees. And back in the top view, we need to reposition the cursor, because using these tools, the 3D cursor serves as the pivot point for the rotations. And we can see that we can't seem to find the interface for this, and that's because you need to be in edit mode. So we tab into edit mode, and we can see on the mesh tools panel in the editing buttons window the spin duplication, and the screw tool. And if we press the spin button, we get some spinning taking place, but it's not what we expected. And that's because these tools use the viewing angle as the plane that the spinning takes place on. So we need to switch to the top view, and we can see that now it's spinning the way we're expecting. So your viewing angle is very important. And in the tutorial, I use the spin dupe tool for no real reason. And I set the degrees. Well, here I'm just going to set it to 93, just some arbitrary number. And we can rotate clockwise and counterclockwise. And clicking the spin dupe button, we can see that we have our geometry duplicated and spun around the 3D cursor based on our settings. And then we can press the F key with all the geometry selected, and then select segment because we want it to loft between the segments of the duplicated geometry. And let's undo that. And you can also use the spin tool, and you don't have to go through the skinning step. If you just press spin, it will spin it based on your settings, and it will automatically loft between the vertices. And we can also reposition the 3D cursor and use these tools again, and also use different settings, and just continue to create geometry, however we want to. But it's important to note that the viewing angle and the 3D cursor are key issues in using these tools. Okay, now let's talk about creating custom transform widget orientations. And we'll go back to layer 3, and let's add a cube. Alright, just want to start with something that has different angles. And in edit mode, let's select all the geometry and select subdivide smooth. And we'll use the default settings. And that will subdivide it and also apply a smoothing effect. And now we can see that if we enable our transform widget, we have different orientations that we can set. And that works fine for the object. But what if we have another object and we want to move it along the normal of another face in another object? Well, we can use the custom orientations tool to allow us to do that. And so let's add another object, a cube, and we'll select some geometry in this object. And we can see the orientation along the normal, and we want to be able to move this cube along that same direction. But how can we do that? So in edit mode, in the object with the selected faces that we want to align to, we can go to the view menu and select transform orientations, and then click the new button, give it a name, and it will create a new orientation for our transform widget based on the averaged normal of all the faces that we select. In this case, we only have one face selected, so it's going to use the normal of this one face. And so then now that we've done that, we can see that new orientation in the menu and apply that to the widget with any other geometry or object selected in our scene. And this is very useful for creating orientations and translations and what have you relative to other objects. And there's really no other way to do this without using this tool. Now let's go back into our scene on layer 1. And the way we applied this, one way we applied it in the scene was we created a normal based on geometry selected in the rail, and that allowed us to move things up and down the rail for the steps. And that's how we were able to position the decorative supports and the bracket that we put on the other side. And we can easily move that anywhere we want to along the rail by using that custom orientation. And that's it. Okay, now we want to take a look at how we can use edge loops to control the corners of objects. And that will help to convey how hard the object is, or, to give a better idea of what it's made of. And so let's go to layer 3 again. Let's start with a plane, and we'll just scale it, add some loops, and just make some changes to it. Let's move this down, move that up. All right, just make a surface with some rather extreme changes in angles. And we apply a subsurf modifier. We'll set it to level 2. And when doing this, it's important to pay attention to the original cage mesh that you're using, as opposed to the subsurf effects, because it's easy to create edge loops that are positioned too close to each other. And so we can see we have a nice rounded and smooth surface. And if we add an edge loop using Control R, it's easy, like I said, it's easy to position it too far. So let's turn off the subsurf modifier, and now we can see exactly where we're placing that edge on our model. And then we can easily turn that back on. And now let's add some edge loops down the center. And we can, using the button that I clicked, we can see our interpolated surface created by the subsurf modifier and our original mesh cage at the same time. And so we add our 2 edge loops and then scale them outward. And now we have some nicely sharpened corners that aren't perfectly sharp, but we don't want them to be anyway. At least I don't for this model. And now we can add an edge loop to control this transition. And it's also important to note that the distance that these loops are from the actual turning point will control the sharpness. And we can press Control E and select the edge slide to slide an edge to help us control that after the fact, after we've actually added that edge loop. And so I want to create a surface with 3 different degrees of sharpness simply by using edge loops. So we have a really sharp edge or turn on that part, and then different degrees of sharpness at the other points. And so this is very important for adding a beveling effect to objects that have been smoothed using the subsurf modifier. Okay, now let's look at how we can use the 3D cursor as a rotation pivot. I'm going to select one of the decorative supports that we did, and then go into a local view with numpad/. And we use this in the tutorial, this technique in the tutorial, to help us to reshape our decorative support. And what you can do is select the geometry, and I'm going to enable the rotation aspect of the widget. And you can see that we're having a hard time getting this to rotate in a predictable way, or the way that we want, rather. So let's change the pivot control to 3D cursor, and then reposition the 3D cursor. And you can see the widget moves to the 3D cursor now, and now we can rotate from that point and around that point. And so we'll select some other geometry, reposition the cursor, and then rotate from that point. And then we can adjust things to, it's not going to be perfect deformation, but it's a great way to get better control of rotating geometry. And you can also do this in object mode as well. And so we can select geometry, reposition the cursor, and we can do this repeatedly to get the shape that we want. Okay. And that's it. I'm going to switch back to median point for the pivot rotation or the pivot control, and then undo these changes. And that's it. Okay, now let's take a look at how we can use the array modifier. And in this case, we're going to use it to create some steps similar to what we did in the tutorial. So we'll go to layer 3, add a cube, and then scale it. And then we want to delete any unnecessary faces. Okay. And then back in object mode, let's scale it down and then bring it up. And let's go to the array the modifier listing and select array. This is in the editing buttons window. And let's go to the object buttons and enable the wire display mode so we can better see the individual objects. Now the array modifier is a bit taller than the other panels, so it might be more convenient to split a window and align it to the vertical orientation by right-clicking and selecting vertical. And now we can better see everything at once. And we can see that it defaults to a count of 2 and a relative offset along the x-axis to 1. And that's generally going to be the width of the bounding box of the object. So you can see that they're both connected. And we can adjust the value for each of the axes, and if we set it to z -1, that's going to have the second object be aligned to the bottom. And we can increase the count. And you can see as we edit the original object, all of the others will be edited accordingly. All right. Okay. And just to give an example, let's say we have a bit of separation in the parts and the different objects that we've had the array modifier create. We can enable the merge option, and that way when we finally apply the array modifier, it will make sure that those vertices are connected, but sometimes they're too far apart, and so we can increase the limit value until they connect. Okay, and so when we apply the mirror modifier, the array modifier, it will actually merge those vertices so we have one complete object. And you can see that they're actually merged. All right. And that's how you can use the array modifier to create steps. Okay, the last thing we want to talk about is using tapered extrusions and imperfect alignments to add a little bit more realism to your scene. You can see here at the bottom of the trim for the window, we've extruded down and tapered it in instead of just simply intersecting these objects with the window sill. And that's important because it creates a nice shadow and it shows that these objects are in fact individual pieces. And you don't always need it, but if you do enough of it, it really helps to add some extra realism to the scene. that you would get and that you would actually need to help sell the scene a little bit better. So you can see how things are not perfectly matching, not perfectly intersecting. And at the top here, you can see that there are gaps in between the pieces and some beveling here and there to help that. And that's very important. That's one of the things that makes CG look like CG, is when things are perfectly sharp. There's no beveling, and things intersect perfectly all over the place in your scene. And they just don't look like there's been any kind of construction of the materials. They just seem to be in place. So using angled extrusions or bevels between objects and imperfect alignments can really help to sell the fact that a scene has been constructed. And I think that adds to the realism.